Subcommittees will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. At this time, I will make my opening statement. Over the past 3 months, 3 deadly terrorist attacks have struck the United Kingdom. An additional 5 other plots were thwarted. These were just the latest in a wave of deadly terrorist attacks that have swept Europe since 2014. In 3 years, there have been more than 36 attacks across Western Europe, killing nearly 400 people, including a number of Americans. The number of potential plots has skyrocketed, posing a serious challenge to European authorities. According to British authorities, they are investigating as many as 23,000 suspected and 500 potential plots. While security services have been lucky all of the time to protect our freedom, the terrorists just have to get lucky once to threaten our sense of safety. Terrorists are also no longer focusing on big, sophisticated attacks. Everyday items such as kitchen knives, delivery trucks are now used as tools of terror. The evil is directed to anyone, be it the French police patrolling the streets of Paris or children and their families exiting a concert in Manchester. They have struck bystanders in the heart of European capitals and targeted symbols of Europe's rich culture. They've also struck small towns, killed priests, imams, and rural communities. To many, this challenge seems impossible. How can we stop such relentless murder? The first step is not giving in to defeatism. We cannot accept this terror as the new norm. Some people, unfortunately, are accepting terror as a way of life. We also cannot write off this as a European problem. The terrorists want to destroy our shared values and our way of life. They want to kill Americans as much as Europeans, and we must stand together with Europe and fight this battle together. Frankly, our European partners have put up with dangerous extremism far too long. Groups openly advocating Islamic law, calling for the end of democracy, and supporting a brand of Islam shared by ISIS operate freely across the European continent. These groups are breeding grounds for extremism and ground zero for terrorist recruitment. We must not allow our Western values to be exploited by those who seek to destroy those values. And we must not allow the technology born of our free and enterprising societies to be exploited for murder by terrorist groups. Terrorists today use social media and apps to spread their hate, to fundraise, to recruit, and to advise untrained supporters how to carry out murder. They even offer plots on how to build bombs on social media. We must fight the terrorists both on the battlefield and online. Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook have taken some steps to shut down extremist accounts. We applaud those efforts and stand ready to assist them to do more. Others need to do a lot more. Specifically, Telegram, which has been described as the app of choice for jihadists, is one of the services not doing near enough. If we seriously want to defeat terrorism, we will have to bring the fight to cyberspace. Last year, I introduced the Combat Terrorist Use of Social Media Act, which requires a strategy to get terrorists offline. The bill eventually became law as a part of the Department of State Authorities Act, and we still are waiting for the administration to provide this critical strategy because lives are at stake. Additionally, we must keep the vital intelligence sharing channels with our allies open. Since ISIS made its rapid advance across the Middle East in 2014, a concerning amount of Westerners have made their way to the terrorist battlefields. This is especially true in Europe. As many as 5,000 Europeans have traveled to Iraq and Syria. Now that ISIS is losing on the battlefield, many of these foreign fighters may want to bring the fight back home and kill people where they originate from. A recent report on jihadist attacks in the West says that 73% of attackers are citizens of the country they are attacking, and as many as 82% of attackers have been previously flagged by law enforcement authorities. Sharing intelligence will help us to spot these individuals returning from battlefields. Intelligence sharing can only be useful if we protect our borders from these individuals. One of the London Bridge terrorists earlier this month was allowed to enter the United Kingdom despite being put on a security watch list. If someone has been flagged for terrorism, they should not be able to enter another country until that case has been closed. What is the purpose of placing someone on a watch list if that person is able to travel freely? Vigilance is more critical today than ever before. The terrorists will exploit our values and loopholes to maximize death, fear, and terror. We must stand together and fight this threat with our European allies, because a threat to one is really a threat to all. And I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Poe and Chairman Rohrabacher, members there, and Ranking Member Meeks, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. Chairman Poe and I, as well as other members of our subcommittees, have introduced resolutions regarding terrorist attacks when they've been carried out against our European allies, including countries that stood with us in honoring their Article 5 commitments under our NATO alliance. We stand with them in solidarity of this recent and all too frequent loss of innocent lives in their countries. We're convening this hearing because understanding how to address this threat to our allies is not only an issue related to their security and our own, but also an arena where there's an incredible opportunity to learn from and collaborate with our European partners. Europe faces diverse and significant challenges in the fight against terrorism and extremism. At the country level, the landscape is unique to each country, with foreign fighter travel posing a significantly greater threat for some, whereas for others, the individuals carrying out these attacks were radicalized without ever leaving their country. At the regional level, our allies' commitments to open borders within the EU proved to be a challenging aspect of European integration within the context of the fight against terrorism. However, I've seen firsthand how member states and EU institutions have taken this threat seriously and how they've been working diligently to improve their collaboration around tracking individuals who may have been radicalized and in identifying the best ways to tackle this threat. They've also experimented with different models for rooting out and preventing extremism and for dealing with foreign fighters returning home from ISIL-held areas. Some models have relied heavily on civil society organizations and communities themselves and investing in productive collaboration between them and law enforcement. Some have focused on inclusive strategies to address extremism by working closely with the women in these communities and with religious leaders. Others have tried to address the profound threat of radicalization in prisons, where one strategy to imprison and therefore remove the threat posed by those who travel abroad to support ISIL and other terrorist organizations backfired and instead exacerbated that threat. They are also exploring different ways to remove extremist content online that's used to recruit vulnerable individuals to engage in terrorist activity and to take down terrorist financing and money laundering schemes that make it possible for ISIL and others to fund the operations that target innocent civilians in these brutal attacks. As we work here in Congress and with agencies in the executive branch to make sure we're nimble and effective in countering terrorist threats here and threats to our allies abroad, we can learn a lot from the efforts of our European friends. So today, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what we can learn from Europe and their experiences with terrorism and the efforts to combat it, as well as what we can do better here in the United States to work with our European partners to eradicate the threat of terrorism here at home and abroad. I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Chair will now recognize Chairman Dana Rohrabacher from California, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats, for his opening remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. I always want to call him Judge Poe.
You should.
It is. Your Honor, thank you very much for holding this hearing jointly with the Europe and Eurasia Subcommittee, which I am the chairman of. So thank you to the witnesses as well. Our partners and our allies in Europe have suffered terribly at the hands of violent Islamic terrorists. We can say that. For a long time, our federal government didn't seem to be able to say that. The latest outbursts of violence in the United Kingdom have been shocking to all of us. The resilience of the British people, however, is inspiring and reminds me of why America is fortunate to call the British people our friends. This hearing serves as one more example of our transatlantic solidarity and our commitment to confront and destroy evil forces in this world. These same forces seek to brutally murder innocent people in order to terrorize the people of the world into submission to their fanatic brand of Islam. While our strength and will remains consistent, the tactics and methods of extremist Islamicists continue to evolve. As our police and security services have been foiling elaborate plots and break up terrorist networks, ISIL and other terrorist organizations create new kind of plots that require more ingenuity and more flexibility to counter. Such insidious methods are hard for any security service to thwart. As we see today, police forces in Europe are being especially challenged. Large migrant populations, some of which have remained famously unintegrated into their new country, present a perplexing challenge that pits humanitarian impulses to try to help poor refugees against the necessity of protecting one's own populations. To some extent, these domestic issues are the ones that European citizens and European governments will have to work out to their own satisfaction and find a balance between these humanitarian impulses and these ideas of protecting their society. However, we Americans must stand in solidarity against what evildoers do, against those evildoers who murder vulnerable populations to achieve their ends. I look forward to learning from the witnesses today on how the United States might be able to lend a hand to our European friends that are under attack and understand also the threat that faces us. And one last point that I would like to add into the discussion, and that is I had the pleasure of actually going after one terrorist attack in Boston with my ranking member at the time, and we were there in order to see if there could be cooperation between Russia and the United States in dealing with the terrorist threat. I would say that when we left, I was very satisfied that the Russian government was willing to work with us, and they actually gave us information at that time, which was very valuable in analyzing what had happened in this massacre of people at the Boston Marathon. With that said, since that time, our relations with Russia have gone down so dramatically that it has hindered us from working together with the Russians to defeat this threat to the planet. This is a threat, we're talking about radical Islamic terrorism, is a threat to every good person on the planet, whatever country they come from. And let me just note, I'm interested in hearing our witnesses to see if there is something, if you believe that working with Russia in trying to thwart radical Islamic terrorism is something that should be on our to-do list. So with that said, thank you for being with us today. I look forward to hearing your testimony, and I especially want to thank Judge Poe for calling this hearing and letting my subcommittee participate.
I thank the gentleman from California. Chair recognizes the ranking member on the Europe-Eurasia and Emerging Threats Subcommittee, Mr. Meeks from New York, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe and Chairman Robacher, for calling this hearing to address the growing threat to come to that's coming, and that is with or at our allies in Europe, terrorism. Let me just point out, it's not only a threat to our allies in Europe, however, it's a threat to those outside of NATO as well. It's a threat to our free democratic system in this sense, and we need our allies together. In fact, we had a meeting today with the Secretary General of the UN. When asked what was his #1 fear it was the international aspect. He stated it was the international aspect of terrorism and how they can try to come together to create a global terrorist threat. So it is extremely timely and I think important to appreciate the effort to signal that this problem, that we have specifically for our European allies, because they're asking, what are we thinking and how can we work together? It's especially important when we find that our president has found it difficult at times to talk about the importance of such alliances. Because as Mr. Keating has indicated, after 9/11, that is the only time when Article 5 was triggered. So I would hope that we speak with one voice in regards to our president not sending conflicting messages out about NATO and the EU. In fact, it was disturbing when I saw the new Pew polling shows how drastically confidence in the United States president has eroded around the world, not just in Europe. And a fractured transatlantic alliance allows more space for terrorists to recruit and act both in Europe and here at home. Terrorism in Europe is a multifaceted threat that, while credible and deadly in some countries, have proven to be more nuanced in others. Most recently, in the United Kingdom and France, for example, we witnessed a barrage of coordinated and other lone wolf attacks. However, in Central Europe, governing politicians point to welcoming refugee policies in other European countries as a leading contributor to terrorism in order to push their agenda of stronger border control. In fact, you have to go all the way to Russia to find similar examples of terror in Eastern Europe. But in Turkey, another NATO ally that has been under attack by terrorists, have pummeled cities across the country, but seemingly received less attention for doing so. So this brings me to my first point of clarification: threat perception. Politicians on all sides in the media are attracted to shocking stories of terror in Europe. These acts have taken center stage with the help of CCTV and cell phones that can immediately transmit harrowing videos across the world. In this sense, advanced technology has made the terrorized aspect of terrorism a lot easier, and also something that we must focus on, because the threat is very real. Foreign fighters from Western Europe, the Balkans, and Russia will return home from Syria having perhaps become more radicalized in their quest for glory. Some may return home disheartened, giving our authorities an easier opportunity to learn more about the attraction. And we've got to figure out the difference in the two so that we can make sure it's to our advantage. One key aspect to preventing radicalization in the first place, which is something that we should look at also, is understanding the drivers that push a young man or woman into such radical territory. Thankfully, we have best practice examples that show us there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that the problem is evolving. Italy, a country with thousands of migrants and refugees arriving on its shores, is able to accept them in a humane manner, discern the proper status for the people, and move the process along. The process is by no means perfect, yet with the help of Frontex and Europol and international humanitarian organizations are absolutely essential. And the American story can be of use here. I believe that despite our bumps and bruises, we can help European nations in integrating communities into their societies. On paper, European states may be all-inclusive, but this often differs in practice, which it does as well here in the United States. As a result, some communities are forgotten or isolated and susceptible to radicalization. So we've got to focus on what we can do to try to prevent those from being radicalized. And so I look forward to engaging with our witnesses to discuss how the U.S. can learn from and help our European allies who are under attack. And I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from New York. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. And without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of this record. I ask that each witness keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. If you see a red light come up in front of you, that means stop. I'll introduce each witness and give them time for their opening statements. Mr. Seamus Hughes is the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. He's an expert on terrorism, homegrown violent extremism, and countering violent extremism. Mr. Robin Simcox is the Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He specializes in counterterrorism and national security policy. Dr. R. Kim Cragen is the Senior Research Fellow for Counterterrorism at the National Defense University. Recently left a position as political scientist at the RAND Corporation and also has taught at Georgetown University and the University of Maryland. Ms. Georgia Homer is the Director of CVE at the United States Institute of Peace, where she oversees a broad portfolio of CVE and rule of law related subjects and projects and research. She chairs the USIP Working Group on Counter-Violent Extremism. And Mr. Hughes, we'll start with you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman, ranking members, distinguished members of the committee, it is a privilege to be invited to speak to you today. Europe is facing a sustained threat from the Islamic State. It is an estimated more than 5,000 Europeans have traveled to Syria to join ISIS. The percentage of European foreign fighters who have returned to their countries of departure is estimated as high as 30%. In the United States, some 250 Americans have traveled or attempted to travel to ISIS-controlled territory. Of the 250, the Program on Extremism has identified more than 60 U.S.-based individuals who successfully migrated to Syria. There is not a typical profile of an American or European ISIS recruit. They vary in socioeconomic background, age, gender, location, and the degree of religiosity. Until recently, ISIS operated a relative safe haven from which they could plan attacks. Despite recent territorial losses, it continues to maintain a cadre of sympathizers who feel both an obligation to help the caliphate. This is one of the main factors that helps explain the wave of attacks, both thwarted and successful, that have hit Europe and the United States in recent months. Since 2014, we've identified 51 attacks in Europe and North America. The vast majority of the perpetrators were citizens of the country on which they committed the attack. Only 5% of those who carried out the attacks were refugees or asylum seekers. Most had a prior criminal past. Less than 10% were directly ordered by ISIS to commit the attacks. In most cases, the attackers were ISIS-inspired or had some touch point, but no explicit direction. About 20% of the attackers were returning foreign fighters, but those that did commit those attacks were more lethal in their attacks. The majority of the perpetrators who pledged allegiance to ISIS before their attacks and after their attack. ISIS took credit for about 40% of them. France has experienced the highest number of attacks at 17, followed closely and perhaps surprisingly by the United States with 16 attacks. Attacks in the US tend to be significantly more unstructured, spontaneous than Europe, even though some of them, Orlando and San Bernardino being good examples, have been no less deadly. According to Europol, there have been 395 jihadist-related arrests in 2014, 687 in 2015, and 718 in 2016. Numbers are much lower in the United States, where 18 individuals were arrested for terrorism-related activities in 2014, 75 in 2015, which was a banner year for us, and just 36 in 2016. Unlike Europe, the United States does not seem to possess extensive homegrown militant organizations that provide in-person ideological or logistical support to individuals drawn to ISIS. Jihadist propaganda has been, and it continues to be, easily accessible through various online platforms for the last 10 years. It has played a role in radicalizing Westerners. Now, with the advent of numerous social media applications, a would-be recruit can access real-time support and have a stronger sense that they're part of a wider network. An important dynamic that's at play right now is ISIS has systematically employed what we call ISIS virtual entrepreneurs, who use social media to connect people in the West. These are individuals in Raqqa, about 6 to 8 English language folks that are reaching out to Americans and Europeans. Individuals like Junaid Hussain, a British citizen. They were involved in at least 21% of domestic plots in the US. During that same time period, 19 of 38 ISIS-linked plots in Europe involved some form of online instruction. Technology companies have addressed ISIS online activities in 2 ways: content-based regulation, and counter-messaging. Although well-meaning, the current approaches by Twitter, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, to name a few, may not necessarily address the new types of encrypted channels on platforms like the chairman mentioned, Telegram, now commonly frequented by violent extremists. And even though online radicalization phenomenon receives a lot of attention, offline dynamics still matter a great deal. That one-on-one human interaction still matters. Perhaps more than in the US, physical networks in Europe remain of significant importance. Finally, it's important to note that far-right movements in Europe have taken advantage of the recent wave of ISIS-inspired attacks in Europe to mobilize old and new followers. These groups tend to ignore the distinctions between Islam, Islamism, and jihadism, seeing all Muslims as a threat. It has triggered indiscriminate attacks against innocent Muslim communities. We have seen how both extreme movements, jihadist and extreme far-right, have fed off each other and used this to assist in their recruitment efforts. This pervasive dynamic of reciprocal radicalization between jihadists and far-right extremists is a troubling trend that needs to be monitored. Thank you for an opportunity to testify before you. I welcome your questions.
Mr. Simcox.
Thank you. Chairman Poe, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. The views I express in this testimony are my own and do not represent the official position of the Heritage Foundation. My goal this afternoon is to highlight the severe threat that Islamist terrorism poses to Europe. There are several aspects to the threat which I will discuss today. The first is the scale. As we all know, recently there's been much discussion by governments across the continent of the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters. This refers to the at least 5,000 to 6,000 Europeans who have fought alongside ISIS and other Islamist groups in Syria and Iraq and are now returning to their home countries. Most devastatingly, members of the cell that committed ISIS's attacks in Paris in November 2015, killing 130 and wounding 368, had traveled to Syria from Europe, fought and trained with ISIS, and then returned to Europe to carry out an attack. This cell also contained ISIS members who had entered Europe from Syria after making false asylum claims. While the majority of Syrian refugees are not tied to terrorism, Germany in particular has seen a sharp uptick in the threat it faces following the recent influx. There was an 8-fold increase in plots between 2015 and 2016, largely due to a surge of those involving refugees. In fact, Germany faced more Islamist plots last year than it did in the entire 2000 to 2015 period. As the US has experienced with the attacks in San Bernardino and Orlando, European governments also have a very significant problem with homegrown radicals. To give an idea of the scale of this threat, the UK has approximately 23,000 terror suspects on the radar. Within this are 3,000 suspects assessed to be the most imminent threat. However, such assessments will never be foolproof, and there always lies the possibility that the likes of Westminster Bridge attacker Khalid Massoud, who was on the radar but not thought to be an imminent danger, slips through the net. The second aspect is the breadth of terrorism throughout Europe. Data from my forthcoming heritage research demonstrates that the number of plots Europe has faced since 2014 has risen year on year. Between January 2014 and the end of May 2017, there had been 15 separate countries targeted, most commonly Belgium, France, Germany, and the UK. This year, there have been multiple attacks on traditional Islamist targets in the UK and France. Yet an ISIS-linked asylum seeker from Uzbekistan also killed 5 people and injured 15 in a truck attack in Stockholm, and an Italian-Tunisian inspired by ISIS stabbed multiple police officers and soldiers at a train station in Milan. Furthermore, while there are certainly trends, it's impossible to build that catch-all profile of who will carry out these attacks. It's not just young men, for example. Khalid Massoud, the Westminster Bridge attacker, was 52. My research has even shown an uptick in plotting by teenagers and girls. For example, in February 2016, a radicalized 15-year-old German girl in contact with ISIS stabbed a police officer in Hanover. So you have those who have criminal records and those who do not, those who trained with terrorists and those who have not, those who are well-educated or affluent, as well as those who are poorly educated or from a lower socioeconomic background. All were drawn into the terrorist orbit and planned attacks in Europe. The third aspect is the range of weapons now used by terrorists. Since November 2015, Belgium, France, Germany, and the UK have all seen operatives acquiring the expertise and materials to assemble suicide bombs without having their plans thwarted. There has not been a lack of willing volunteers to carry out these suicide missions, including Salman Abedi, who committed the attack in Manchester. There has also been a multitude of plots involving firearms, knives, or some other form of edged weapon, such as a machete or an axe, and, of course, the use of vehicles. There have been no publicly disclosed instances in which these vehicular attacks have been thwarted by authorities. We've seen the consequences of this in Nice, Berlin, Stockholm, London, and elsewhere. Because of such factors, over 1,400 people were injured and over 300 people killed in Islamist attacks in Europe in the past 3.5 years. Included in this number are 9 Americans. Chairman Poe, distinguished members of the subcommittee, the grave danger that terrorism poses to Europe is only likely to increase. The US must work with Europe to defeat this threat. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this with you, and I look forward to any questions.
I thank the gentleman. Excuse me, Dr. Cragen.
I'd like to thank the chairs and the ranking members for inviting me to testify on the subject of the threat posed to Europe and the West by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. Over the past 20 years, I've explored the topics of what motivates individuals to become terrorists, how terrorist groups adapt, and counterterrorism. Much of this research has focused on what is often referred to as foreign fighters, or individuals who leave their homes and travel abroad to fight. My written testimony provides the details of this research, and I plan to summarize it briefly today. As you know, ISIS stepped into the global spotlight in June 2014 after its spokesman, al-Adnani, announced a newly formed Islamic Caliphate. Soon thereafter, ISIS began to consolidate control over territory within Syria and Iraq, but it also established provinces outside the Levant. Today, ISIS has 25 provinces in 11 countries. The apparent focus by ISIS on control over territory caused many to conclude at the time that ISIS was less interested in attacking the West than al-Qaeda. This is proven to be false. The first successful attack by a foreign fighter returnee took place in May 2014 at the Jewish Museum in Brussels. The perpetrator was part of a cell overseen by al-Adnani until his death in August 2017. This suggests that ISIS leaders intended to attack the West months before they even declared a caliphate. The overall pattern of attacks by ISIS reinforces this conclusion. Between June 2014 and May 2017, ISIS operatives conducted approximately 225 attacks outside Syria and Iraq. 42% were external operations, or attacks outside of those provinces. To put this in perspective, ISIS has been more aggressive in its external operations than al-Qaeda. Only 10% of al-Qaeda's attacks between 2008 and 2010 took place outside of countries with affiliates. 10% for al-Qaeda, 42% for ISIS. And to truly understand this threat, we need to examine both successful and failed attacks. And the numbers become even more grim. 58% of all ISIS external operations, including both attacks and plots, have taken place in the West. Let's take the November 2015 attacks in Paris as an example. There were 9 core operatives, 7 foreign fighter returnees, 2 Iraqis. They recruited an additional 21 individuals to help with logistics once they arrived in Europe. 7 of these recruits were foreign fighter returnees, and 14 were not. Foreign fighters return home to conduct attacks. They also recruit others to help. That's the bad news. The good news is that the Paris attacks acted as a catalyst for the West. Since then, Spain has detained 159 individuals and interrupted at least 6 plots. France has foiled 22 plots. The UK has detained almost 300 and foiled 18 plots. In fact, the combined efforts by law enforcement, intelligence, and military forces led to a plummet in the number of successful external operations by foreign fighters in late 2016. This predates the Mosul offensive. It tells me that the U.S. and its allies have come up with the correct formula to minimize the threat posed by foreign fighter returnees. But it's only a short-term solution because arresting individuals preemptively causes short prison terms. It also presents the threat of prison radicalization, and it's hard to see how this formula can be applied by less affluent countries. Unfortunately, ISIS also has proven itself to be adaptive, and the recent attacks in England tragically underscore that there's still more to be done. I mentioned that successful attacks by foreign fighters plummeted in August 2016, but the overall trend in external operations continues to go up. So why? As attacks by foreign fighters plummeted, they were replaced by attacks conducted by local recruits with directed guidance from ISIS fighters based in Syria, sometimes referred to as virtual planners or virtual entrepreneurs. Virtual planners identify local recruits, introduce them to individuals with technical expertise, and help pick the target, all via Telegram or WhatsApp. Which brings me to the final question of what more can be done. I don't want to leave the impression that we've solved the problem in the West by foreign fighter internees. We haven't, but the most urgent need is to find a way to take this formula developed by the US and its European allies and expand it geographically. And beyond this most urgent need, we need to fit these and other programs within a wider trans-regional strategy that includes a global architecture to address the threat from foreign fighter returnees and virtual planners.
And Ms. Holmer.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and ranking members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Please note that my comments reflect my own views and not necessarily that of the U.S. Institute of Peace. I began my career working on terrorism in Europe for the FBI over 20 years ago. That was the tail end of a wave of Marxist and nationalist political violence in Europe that included kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations that led to the loss of many lives and generated the same feelings of fear and outrage as we're experiencing today. The wave of political violence being experienced in Europe is different today, however. The groups are less cohesive. We're witnessing not only directed attacks, but self-inspired active violence. The goals, motives, and justification for the violence have changed as well, and the ideology is rooted now in a narrative of religious militancy. Unlike the wave of terrorism in Europe in the 1970s through the 1990s, the targets today are more indiscriminate, and there's more of a willingness on the part of attackers to die. But what has also changed has been the response. Counterterrorism investigations today are more sophisticated. There are more mechanisms for international cooperation and collaboration. There's also been a steadily increasing awareness and understanding that effective counterterrorism operations are critical, but insufficient without an investment in prevention. Law enforcement and security services cannot possibly anticipate and disrupt every potential attack, especially low-level attacks involving one man and a truck and a knife. Understanding why individuals are willing to give their lives to a violent extremist movement or cause, and working to address the issues and grievances that push them in that direction is a critical investment of American time and resources. Last year, USIP conducted research on understanding why the small European country of Kosovo had one of the highest rates per capita of foreign fighters traveling to support ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The answer, in short, was that a robust recruitment infrastructure had flourished in the region, and youth found their messages particularly compelling because of their frustration with their own lives, lack of opportunity, conflicting ideas about their identity, and an inherited legacy of conflict and violence. Kosovo faces a multifaceted challenge now, managing the return of those who went to Iraq and Syria, as well as those who never left but have radicalized and are intent on causing harm, and also preventing new recruits from forming and radical groups from flourishing. Kosovo is not alone in facing these challenges, but their experience illustrates how important it is to have effective programs and strategies to prevent individuals from radicalizing and joining these groups, or rejoining once they're out of prison. I would like to offer that there are three critical and interrelated areas in which efforts to prevent radicalization can be most effectively advanced, in which our European partners have made significant progress, in part because of their long history of dealing with terrorism. First is increasing public awareness and engagement in preventing radicalization. Preventing early-stage radicalization, especially for those who've never engaged in any criminal activity, is out of reach of law enforcement and is more appropriately addressed by family and community members who know and care about those who are vulnerable to recruitment. Much of this work in Europe is led by NGOs, but supported by municipal and national governments in the EU. Community-level programs involving teachers and social workers, religious leaders, and families who help build the resilience of youth and intervene appropriately when they show signs of influence have proliferated in Europe. These efforts include, but go beyond, countering the radical ideology that underpins these groups and attracts groups to address the relationships and practical issues that make youth vulnerable to recruitment in the first place. Ideology, after all, is how they are recruited, not why they join. Secondly, ensuring effective and accountable criminal justice and law enforcement procedures. An individual's touch points with the criminal justice sector can profoundly influence his or her trajectory away from or towards violence. Police play critical and sophisticated roles in deterrence. The establishment of accountable information sharing mechanisms between the public and law enforcement helps ensure that individuals are not prematurely criminalized, and many European law enforcement services have implemented referral mechanisms, especially as more and more non-government actors are involved in this space. Third, working to prevent recidivism. After prison, many individuals return to the same environment in which they radicalized in the first place. And even if they do not engage in violent activity directly, they may continue to espouse ideas that encourage violence or help with recruitment. Effective reintegration programs are an imperative, and Europe has a number of programs that were originally developed to address members of biker gangs, neo-Nazis, and quasi-criminal groups. Some of these programs have been tailored in recent years to address the reintegration of former violent extremists and support their continued disengagement from violence. The U.S. has been a leader in efforts to prevent violent extremism and counterterrorism and can continue to support our allies in Europe in this role in prevention. Thank you for your time.
I thank the witnesses, and thank you for staying on time. We all appreciate that. The chair will reserve its questions for last. I'll recognize the chairman of the European Subcommittee, Mr. Rohrabacher, for his questions.
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank the witnesses that you've given us a really good foundation to look at this. And, you know, it's perplexing. People's lives are at stake, and your statistics and your analysis of it. Frankly, we needed your help, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Your Honor, for holding this hearing. I'd like to ask you have some information for us on this, I'm sure. How much spying is being done by our government of our own people? I mean, every time it's come for a vote, I voted against permitting the government to have more spying on American citizens, all right? And that's what we're faced with this decision. You know, we're going to allow these more and more people to tap our telephones or whatever they do, go into our internet systems and things. Do you think that we should be, that's a wrong vote on my part? Am I wrong for not agreeing to allow the law enforcement and internet and our protectors to actually have a greater leverage in spying on American citizens who might be related to someone who migrated here last, 10 years ago or something? Who wants to answer that question? Oh, come on, be courageous. We have to vote on it.
Yeah, I'll take the easy one. I agree with the chairman in terms of the question of intelligence is onefold, right? The fact that you have a FISA and thousands of documents on that individual gives you insight into the person, but it's one thing to have the intelligence, another thing to have their agents and resources to run that down. And I think that's a lot of the problem, the issues we're dealing with in Europe and some parts in America, where you have an influx of information, whether it's social media, whether it's wiretaps and things like that, but not an ability to kind of act on that and not knowing when to act. So to the extent we can kind of limit the data to just exactly what we need and hope kind of bring down the level of general look in this.
We're cooperating with Europe, correctly? Are we involved in spying on European citizens in order to track down these terrorists that we wouldn't be allowed to do in our own country? Anybody know the answer? Go for it.
Well, I know that the European governments are especially the ones that work very closely with the US, of which the UK certainly is one of those countries, are tremendously grateful for the help that the US offers in terms of the intelligence capacity that it provides, which is far outstrips that of the vast majority of European countries. I tend to think, and we have a lot of these debates in the UK as to the privacy, liberty, security debate. It's obviously it's a very tricky one. I tend to think that as long as the oversight is robust, and it seems to me, I'm not a subject matter expert, but having looked at the US intelligence community oversight, seems to be quite robust, certainly compared to many other European governments, some of whom perhaps complain in public about American spying, but then in private are grateful for some of the intelligence that's passed on.
I think that it's highly likely, and I'm not getting the details right now, but probably behind closed doors, that we are conducting extensive listening and hacking, so if you will, overseas, and we are sharing that with our European allies, and I would hope we are. Let me just ask this, go to this one other issue then, before my time comes up here. And I mentioned that the ranking member and I, Mr. Keating, went to Russia, and we met with the head of their renamed KGB, FSB, I guess they call it, and they were very generous with us with information, and they actually gave us some information that we believe gave us a better understanding of the Boston Marathon bomber and where he was coming from and his family background. And that, by the way, I believe, had they shared that with us beforehand, we might have put him on a higher level of observation. And do you think that we should be working with the Russians? I would just tell you, I personally, of course, I'm a lone wolf here in the Congress. We need to be working with Russia to defeat radical Islam, because that threatens their people and it threatens our people. And there is no reason in the world that I think, because we have disagreements in other parts of the world, that cooperation should be in some way shut off. Do you have any thoughts on that? And please feel free.
I'll take that one.
I've run out of time, but I think they'll give you time to answer.
You can answer the question about Russia.
Over the past couple of years, I've been involved in some Track 2 diplomacy discussions with Russian academics, and we've wrestled with this issue of to what extent could we cooperate and how could we cooperate on counterterrorism. So I'll just tell you sort of my impressions from that. We kept getting bogged down. Now, we were academics, so we're not policymakers. We kept getting bogged down, and I'll summarize how we got bogged down. We kept getting bogged down because, as an American, I'm comfortable with a certain amount of instability in pursuit of democratic values. So I'm probably more risk-seeking. I'm willing to accept some risk with democratic values being established. And my Russian counterpart, the ultimate goal was stability. And so we just kept getting bogged down in these areas. Almost everything came down to this almost cultural or value-based tension. And so I would just offer that to you as you think about the practicality of it. We just couldn't seem to come to a lot of solution on it.
But it's worth trying, right?
It was an interesting experience, I'll say that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great hearing between this committee and the Homeland Security Committee I'm on. I spent a great deal of my time looking at issues of terrorism, and it's a complex area. It's no simple solutions. But we're spending some time today on an area that I'm very intrigued in, and I think we haven't come close to maximizing our prevention efforts in. And I was listening to Ms. Homer's testimony as a former FBI person and my own experience as a district attorney. And there's similarities between how we approach crime issues and these terrorist crimes as well. You know, when I was in Europe a couple of years ago, the Hollings Institute was doing a study on trying to find common characteristics among terrorists, people that were radicalized. And, you know, they were dealing with things like whether there was a male role model, strong male presence in the family, and some of these characteristics. In fact, much less scientific. I remember testimony of the former FBI Director Comey in front of our committee describing these people as poor souls. But there's something to that. Ms. Homa, could you tell us from your experience, I could tell from your testimony, some of the common characteristics that are there that make people more prone to being radicalized?
So I think the first answer to that question is that it is unique per individual. There are some common trends that make people more vulnerable. Certainly we find in the European context it has to do with issues of assimilation. It has to do with issues of opportunity. It has to do with exposure to violence, exposure to criminality. And all of those issues make people more vulnerable to recruitment. I think that the challenge, of course, though, when you're dealing with such a large pool of potential recruits, is that it's outside the reach of law enforcement to possibly identify them, especially when you're dealing with such low-level attacks that
Right,
are
so how can we
self-inspired.
empower? I think the committee as a whole here, very strong in their support of empowering women and mothers to be able to recognize this radicalization as it occurs. Are you familiar with any of those?
I'm very familiar with it. There's one NGO based in Vienna called Women Without Borders that's done some very groundbreaking work in this space. And their approach is to work with mothers to help them understand early warning signs of radicalization in their families so that they might intervene. They might know when the role is appropriate for the parents and when it is indeed appropriate to pull in law enforcement into a
I
conversation.
think that law enforcement, you can look at, I had programs like Alternatives to Prosecution for Young People. I had mental health diversions and certain juvenile probation areas. And really, there is that opportunity at an early stage for law enforcement to deal with a lot of these issues that correspond. In any case, here's a question that I am perplexed with, too, when you look at Europe and the U.S. in particular. It's the amount of radicalization that occurs in prisons in Europe versus the radicalization that occurs here. Now, it occurs in both places, but it's not even close in scope, given my knowledge in this area. Why is it so much of more of a problem in Europe? Why is this so commonplace in Europe as opposed to the U.S.? What are the factors there? And what are they doing to correct that? Anyone?
Well, part of the problem is that in Europe, the release rates are a lot quicker than the US, right? So people get, the example I always give is that somebody like, that carried out the Brussels 2016 attack had previously been convicted for a bank robbery where he shot a Kalashnikov at a police officer. I mean, in America, I think that would lead to a pretty lengthy jail sentence. I think in Belgium, he got something like 3 years. And so he had contact with radicals in prison. He was out very quickly again, and he carries out these attacks. I know that European governments are trying all sorts of different strategies to deal with this. France has tried isolating certain high-risk people, certain radicalizers, but then that hasn't really worked. The UK has taken a slightly different tack. I think part of it is down to numbers. There's just been the population of Muslim population in prisons is way disproportionate in comparison to the overall population. And I know that lots of countries are wrestling with different strategies and nobody's been terribly successful. And so I think we just need to keep experimenting, to be frank.
Yes, if I could, one more, Mr. Hughes. Is that all right, Mr. Chairman?
Why not?
Add in terms of the U.S. context, we tend to segregate our convicted terrorists and use specially administrative measures in order to monitor their phones, things like that, put them in Terre Haute or Supermax. So if they're radicalized, and they're just radicalized and the guy is already radicalized next to them. And that tends to work. I would agree with Robin that the numbers are smaller. I would mention a public policy question we need to grapple with. The average prison sentence for an American ISIS recruit is about 13 years. We've had about 2 folks who've already been released. We're going to have to grapple with a large number of Americans who were arrested for ISIS-related activities that are getting out of jail in the not too distant future. And we haven't figured that out. If you talk to Bureau of Prisons or Department of Homeland Security, their eyes glaze over on these questions. And I think it's incumbent on us to roll up our sleeves and figure this out.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from Texas for holding this hearing, and the gentleman from California. I think it's important. It's a broad topic. I don't think we're going to get to all the areas of discussion in this one hearing. I hope we'll do it again. My concern has been ISIL operatives infiltrating the Muslim migration into Europe that we saw last year, last 18 months. A lot of those were military-age men coming into Europe. Countries like Hungary are recognizing their own sovereignty and securing their borders, but you don't have that throughout Europe, especially with Schengen. We're seeing that, free flow of people across Europe was exploited by I believe one of the Brussels attackers or somebody headed to Brussels, had a carload of automatic weapons, grenades, and Semtex. So a lot of folks that I represent are concerned about those folks getting to Europe and staying long enough to gain citizenship and being able to come to this country at some point in the future, not present day, but possibly the future. ISIL's been in existence for 24 months, 36 months, and so we're getting into that time frame where citizenship can be earned, and folks could possibly come to the United States with visa waiver programs, et cetera. Dr. Cregan, you've done a lot of work regarding the threat of returning foreign fighters, Europeans that have gone to Syria and Iraq, Libya, and returned back. Now, we just saw that recently in England. So how can Congress better understand this and fight back against that threat?
So I guess I'll start with the refugee issue. In my data set of external operations, so outside of the provinces, about 3% of the attacks had a refugee involved in them. I'm not saying it's a non-existent threat, but it's very, very low relative to inspired individuals who are already residents and citizens, those directed by virtual planners and foreign fighter returnees. So when you're looking at a risk assessment and you're putting all those in place, my tendency as a counterterrorism professional is to look at the foreign fighter returnees and now the virtual planners. So just to put that in context. Now looking at the foreign fighter returnees, I do think that intelligence cooperation in coordination with law enforcement and military activities has improved significantly. I would say since 2016, late 2015, early 2016, and so we're on the right track. My biggest concern in that area are the foreign fighter returnees that are going to be going to North Africa. And Tunisia, we said all of Europe was 5,000, Tunisia has 6,500. And Tunisia is awfully close to Europe. And so that is my concern. They simply do not have the capacity nor the intelligence assets that we have. So if you're interested in helping out Europe, the next step is actually to broaden that cooperation and try and find a way to help Egypt, help Tunisia, Jordan to a certain extent, make sure that they can absorb and reintegrate their foreign fighter returnees, and those are very, very large numbers that are coming home.
Yeah, so I agree with you on that. Do you think you're going to see, and we already have seen, but do you think you're going to see more border control measures put in place? Less Schengen free travel. We've seen Germany do a little bit of that, France do a little bit of that, but definitely saw Hungary, which wasn't Schengen, I realize that, but concerned about migration into their country or at least through their countries. Do you think Europe will address the open border situation and see more return to border controls, or do you think they're going to continue with the open border situation that we have now? And Dr. Craig and I'll just address that to you. Whichever one would want to answer, but we're on the clock.
So I haven't talked to European officials, so I don't know what they intend to do. As a counterterrorism professional, border security is one part, but personally, in my research, the more you can push out the threat and deal with it outside of Europe, as I said, in sort of North Africa and the Levant, then that's better than relying on border security measures as they're crossing back into Europe, quite frankly. That's just sort of my...
You're talking about a wide range in Middle East and North Africa, and we've seen the fighters coming across from Libya, Tunisia, to Morocco, over to Portugal, over to Spain, into Italy's got a huge problem. People getting on rafts out of Libya to Malta, and to Malta, they're European Union. So there's a lot of issues. That's a big, broad area. The fact of the matter is there are people already in Europe that could be radicalized, and people already in Europe that have traveled from the Middle East through this migration. They're military-age men who could have been inspired before they ever left. They've got a problem in the country. I understand what you're saying, but the problem, what we've seen, have been people inspired in Europe. Maybe they came from North Africa at some point, but they've been there long enough. So the issue today are the people that are in the country, their ability to travel around, and they are getting inspired through online measures. Mr. Chairman, those are some questions I hope the Europeans are asking themselves. We're not going to solve it for them, but I appreciate the information.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to agree this has been a very interesting hearing and something that we've got to really dig into. Let me just try to go a little bit further, I guess, on what Mr. Duncan was talking about, because I hear a lot of folks are now talking about the way to prevent terrorist attacks is by banning immigrants and refugees and individuals from coming back into going into various different countries. So I guess my first question is, do you think by banning immigrants, and I think you said, Ms. Cragen, it was only 3% of individuals who were not coming from from the war areas, those who are returning from battle, who were there. But the actual refugees and immigrants who we can, do you think that by banning all refugees and immigrants, will that cut down on terrorism in these various areas in Europe, or any place in the world for that matter, because terrorism is all over the place now?
Me. The way that you successfully put together a counterterrorism strategy is you have layers and lots of different security measures throughout. So my data suggests that of external operations, that is attacks conducted by ISIS outside of its provinces, its 25 provinces, 3% included somebody who would come through the refugee system. So that's not zero, it's something, but then you start talking about where do you put your resources, because nobody can devote just everything to this problem. Do you devote it to border security measures? Do you devote it to intelligence operations? Do you devote it to military operations? That's sort of what we're talking about. As a counterterrorism professional, I prefer to see more devoted out towards intelligence, law enforcement investigations, and military operations than border security. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't do border security. Now I'm just talking about relative resources and what you devote to what type of operation.
So let me ask Ms. Homer, because one of the things that I've also seen that we could be taking our eye off the ball, for example, in the Western Balkans, when we talk about where there's a space of very high unemployment, disenchantment, and religious extremism present, and I think that can help present a dangerous recipe. So what can be done in this region to help secure pathways or their path towards NATO and EU while minimizing the risk of terror in those particular areas?
I know one issue that's important to the Kosovar government is that they're not members of Interpol. And I think that having the Balkan countries fully integrated into all the cooperative mechanisms that are in place in Europe would be significant. And also acknowledging that the threat is not just from returnees, but from people who are already in the country who haven't left, who may be inspired to engage in acts of violence. And that speaks to not just bolstering law enforcement and intelligence operations, but also to having a commensurate resource commitment to prevention.
Now let me ask this question. As I talk to some of my, some are friends, some are constituents, et cetera, here in the United States, those who happen to be Muslim also, they do say the words that we utilize in the United States and in Europe and others are important. Some would help, words are important. Some helps to recruit or help recruiters recruit individuals. Do you think that words matter and how we entitle or how we title, I should say? For example, I know My friend from California says we're free to now say radical Islamic terrorists, or I heard Mr. Simcox, he indicated, he used the word, he used the phrase Islamist terrorists as opposed to Islamic terror. Does that make a difference, or is that just semantics for us, or et cetera? Does words matter in this regard when we're fighting terror? Ms. Homer.
I think all political violence is an affront to democratic values, regardless of the ideology that underpins it. And while it helps us understand the motives, helps us understand the recruitment dynamics, helps us understand and counter those ideologies to know exactly what they are, I'm not sure there's a very big difference, ultimately, between the types of violence that were inspired by Marxist ideologies in the 1980s or with the separatist groups during that period as well, from what we see today. So while I think it's important as part of our understanding and it's an important piece of a layered counterterrorism strategy, it's only one piece of the puzzle. And overemphasizing it is going to keep us away from the other pieces.
Out of time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious, because we've spent a lot of time on the entity that I call Daesh or ISIS. Some people call it ISIL, and my understanding of the term Levant in its historic context would be essentially the entire Eastern Mediterranean region, extending into what some would argue would be Iraq, to include North African nations currently, Libya, Egypt, as well as, in fact, the island of Cyprus and Greece, et cetera. Is that, you spoke with the Levant, Dr. Craig, is that historically roughly correct as to what the Levant would mean?
Yeah, normally North Africa is the Maghreb, so probably up through Egypt, but you wouldn't then go into Libya and to Algeria. That would be considered the Levant.
And I'm not
Lebanon,
trying to be rude, but
Jordan, yeah.
sure, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, I mean, in the broadest historical sense. And so if you were to refer to ISIL, you would actually be giving a larger geographic footprint to the entity that's ISIS, as opposed to ISIS, which would be Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Am I correct?
I think this is a semantic thing of, do you use the word they used to call themselves? Do you assign something to them? This is the Daesh, this is the ISIS versus
Sure,
the ISIL.
but having spent a little bit of time affiliated with both law enforcement and warfare, it strikes me that unless you wish to bolster your enemy, unless you wish to strengthen your enemy in the view of your enemy themselves and the world, you minimize. You might have referred to them, say, for example, as the JV team, right? I mean, that would be, but normally, traditionally, you don't want to build your enemy up, right? I guess what I'm driving at is that the Levant is larger than Iraq and Syria, and why someone would choose to call them ISIL, which would give them greater credibility, is beyond me, and yet that's been done. I want to speak briefly to FISA. A recent report indicates that up to 5% of FISA court applications and upstream information gathering during the last 2 years of the previous administration was actually used against American citizens. And Section 702 of the Code allows for us to use FISA because it orders that American citizens be masked, wherein those citizens' identities might have accidentally been associated with a foreign intelligence target. Because why? Because we don't know who's called whom. It could be a wrong number, or it could be a call for entirely unrelated methods or reasons. If, in fact, this is the case, and that shakes the confidence of people like my colleague from California and myself in FISA, does that also run the parallel risk of undermining our intelligence gathering operations and stymieing our abilities to stop attacks before they happen, Mr. Simcox?
I'm going to have to say I just don't know enough about the FISA Section 702 regime to be able to answer that.
Mr. Hughes, Seamus, do you have any opinion on that?
No, I would agree with Robin on that.
Okay. I would submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, that if we weaponize Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act processes that have existed in this country since 1979 for over 38 years against Americans, that people like myself and others who are reasonable and appreciate the Bill of Rights, and specifically the Fourth Amendment thereto, might then rail against the use of those particular intelligence gathering techniques. And if we rail against the use of those particular intelligence gathering techniques, I would argue that we would gather less intelligence and therefore be less effective in stymieing or stopping the next attack. And so I would submit that perhaps the blood of the Americans who are victimized in an attack that's missed because a prior administration or individual determined that it was worthwhile and reasonable to completely subvert the intent of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and thus Congress acted appropriately to defend the legitimate privacy expectations of American citizens, that entity or actor might have blood on their hands. I want to switch subjects briefly to the Muslim Brotherhood. I've sourced from probably 4 or 5 different sources a Muslim Brotherhood motto. I know there's a bill that would designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization before this Congress. I understand the political sensitivity as the Muslim Brotherhood engages in things certainly not directly related to terror. But I would ask you, if the Muslim Brotherhood motto is roughly translated into Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, and dying in the name of Allah is our goal, couldn't a reasonable person think that was an imploration to commit extremist acts? Mr. Simcox?
Yeah, I think that the question with the bill is, I think one of the main concerns is whether that you're going to be able to legally designate the Brotherhood as a terrorist entity, and whether that will achieve what we want to achieve. But
Are there subordinate entities to the Brotherhood that might be able to be singled out that would be more accurate? Mr. Hughes?
I think that would.
Sorry. He was nodding, so he got the call.
Yeah, there are a number of Muslim Brotherhood-linked organizations I think you could take a hard look at in terms of...
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I would ask you, Mr. Hughes and Mr. Simcox, I apologize, if you all would please contact my office with the names of subordinate entities that might be more appropriately designated. Thank you.
And I'd ask the gentleman to provide that list to the chair. And the chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses that are here today. I'm a new member of this committee. Prior to coming here, I was on Homeland Security. I was a local mayor in the state legislature in California. I spent a lot of time studying and dealing with state prison issues. In my district, I have a men's prison, a women's prison, and a juvenile detention, which has now been closed. So going back to a question that was asked by Ranking Member Keating regarding our prison system versus the European prison system. If incarcerated people in Europe are spending less time in prison than incarcerated people here in the U.S., wouldn't that be less time that they have inside, a prison system to recruit?
Well, I think part of the problem is people who don't go into prison as radicals but come out of it that way. And so this is especially relevant when you think of ISIS's connections to the criminal nexus and their ability to recruit from criminal fraternities, because you have very influential people within French prisons, let's take an example, who have a very long track record now of being able to connect with people that have gone in for somewhat petty crimes that are going to be leading to release in 6 months to 2 years.
So in U.S. prisons or institutions, we try to separate Mexican mafia, for example, with other gangs, the Bloods and the Crips. We try not to hold them within the same area. Is this different than what is happening in Europe?
Well, Europe, they've experimented with different approaches, but I think that there's definitely been a problem when you've had key radicalizers in among the general prison population and increasing radicalization. The problem is that you get some groups who are concerned if you start putting, for example, terrorist-only wings, then there are complaints that you're creating a British Guantanamo Bay or something like that. I don't find those to be persuasive arguments, but they're the sort of things you hear on the other side.
So let's talk a little bit about community policing. Having come from also that environment, spent a lot of time representing, a city that has high crime in numerous gangs and very at-risk youth. There is a lot to be said about at-risk youth and the lack of services and the lack of education and opportunities. Here in the U.S., I think at least the Muslim community within my district is very much integrated. They're very much a part of the quilt that is the makeup of our very diverse and culturally diverse community, and they're seen as a positive influence in our community, not as a negative influence. They tend to want to work and be a part of the solution with law enforcement and with FBI officials. So in the case of San Bernardino, I mean, that really comes out. And I've lost constituents. I used to represent the city of San Bernardino as a state senator. And it really troubles me that there weren't real signals out there from a young mother with a young baby and a young father. What could we do? What is a lesson there that we could learn, certainly without having to racially profile someone just because of the way they look?
Maybe I'll jump in, and then George has done some really good work on the Resolve Network to look at these kind of community-oriented policing things. But I would say in the U.S. context, community engagement is one step. So I used to do...
Is your mic on?
Yes. I used to...
Talk louder then.
Sorry, sir. I used to do community engagement mostly in Mr. Keating's district, which was you go to a mosque with 300 people in a room and you talk about terrorism, radicalization.
But you don't talk down at them.
No.
You let them talk to you.
No, yeah, you have to. And it has to not be numbers. It has to be human stories, right? How do you reach the kid before they cross the line? When you look at the U.S. cases, you have what we call a bystander effect in the majority of them, where individuals see something that's concerning but don't know what to do with it and don't have the tools to do with it. And we haven't provided, as the U.S. government or communities really, alternatives to prosecution, intervention programs, so that if you have a case like Enrique Marquez, who's on the law enforcement radar for a number of years, but don't have enough to arrest him, we can't veer him off to somewhere else. Our European partners have developed these kind of one-on-one interventions, nascent in some places, but at least they're putting resources behind it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's up.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and the rankings for holding this hearing today on terrorism in Europe. Given the recent terrorist attacks in Europe, especially the 3 attacks that have taken place in the United Kingdom since March, understanding and combating terrorism is increasingly important to both the United States and our allies across the Atlantic. Over 70% of the perpetrators of terrorism in Europe are citizens of the countries they attacked. This is an indication that radicalization is taking place within countries in Europe and can also happen within the United States. Richard A. Stengel, the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, testified before Congress that other countries can better deal with terrorist information operations than the United States. So for all of you, is the current Global Engagement Center being run by the Department of State the best messenger to counter extremism? And also, how should we be coordinating our information operations to counter extremist propaganda to help protect the homeland and help our allies? And whoever feels they can answer.
Yeah, jump in on the Global Engagement Center, the GEC. We've seen a number of different iterations there. I tend to be a believer that the U.S. government shouldn't cede the space, meaning that I'm okay with the stamp of the U.S. government on communications as long as you also have the black, the gray, and the white still going on at the same time. And I think we're seeing an evolution at the GEC of away from this broad-based, here's a 30-second video on YouTube that won't get your target audience, to more of how do we move folks that we've identified in the online space to offline intervention boards or groups, NGOs in Europe and other places where we can start to try to bring these people back in the fold. I would hope the Global Engagement Center moves away from large-scale programming towards more targeted programming. I think you're able to then measure effectiveness. You can go back to them and say, it's working in Congress and need more money, or you can say it's not working, let's shift gears.
On the Global Engagement Center, I think you need to have I think it's important to have an approach that's flexible, that changes, if necessary, region by region. It's not going to be a cookie-cutter strategy that you can just implement across any area you're concerned by. I tend to agree with Seamus. I don't think the U.S. government should cede this space. I know that it's People would say somehow it's an imperfect messenger, but I think while that may be true, what is perfect about this area we're working in? So I hope the U.S. remains engaged.
Okay.
I would just add that the success of any counter-messaging program is that the message itself is local, locally originated and locally given. So the success of any sort of effort like that is rooted in having partnerships in the countries that are the recipients of those messages.
And do you feel, in light of changes that have gone on in the United States, that the countries feel confident in us, like our European allies?
I think that depends country to country.
I still think that there is, whenever I speak to European governments on this, I don't think you should overestimate in the US the distrust that's coming from Europe. People in Europe still want to work with the US on these issues. There is a great level of, trust that still exists, and alliances that have been built up over decades that are not dependent on one president or one party. And so all the conversations I've had with European governments throughout various levels have been people saying, like, how do we increase contacts? How do we carry on working these relationships? Because they know that the US is important on so many levels, be it diplomatic, intelligence, military, all the things that go into forging an effective counterterrorism policy.
It's good to hear. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I'll recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
We in the United States per capita faced far less Islamic extremism from plots hatched on our own soil, which of course excludes 9/11. What is it about what we're doing that is better or worse in terms of assimilating our Muslim American communities and convincing them not to engage in the behavior that we see from Brussels to Paris to London? Mr. Simcox.
Well, there are a host of things. I would offer one quite simple and I hope it doesn't seem trite example. The word you used, assimilation, is not a word that is ever used in Europe. It's not considered.
Is it thought to be politically incorrect?
Yeah, I think people just don't see. People talk about integration, perhaps, but then there's also a lot of debate about, well, should we really expect people to integrate? This is how you allow parallel societies essentially to develop in the way that, unfortunately, we have in Europe. So I think there's an incredible reluctance still to even talk about, like I say, the word assimilation just isn't used. And I think that's an area where Europe certainly needs to change. There are a whole host of other issues relating to the type of immigration that has taken place, whether, for example, the US took in people from more affluent backgrounds, perhaps, as opposed to the waves of migration that came into the UK or Germany, perhaps. I think there's a whole host of things around that you could debate and go back and forth on. But I do think the assimilation via integration one is a kind of interesting component to this.
And I'd point out that we as a country have a much longer period of assimilating people while they still retain their religious traditions. And there's a tendency to think that if you're doing better than someone else, that everything you're doing is right and everything they're doing is wrong. What can we learn? What is Europe doing right that would make sense to do here in the United States? Ms. Homer. Or anyone else who wants to answer.
Sure. Europe is spending a lot more resources and time on the prevention agenda. They have a lot more programs that are about diversion, that are about interventions before people at early stages of radicalization. This is something that the EU has invested heavily in. This is something that happens on both the municipal and the national government level in terms of funding and support, and they have a lot more programs than we do.
And yet they have the bigger problem. Dr. Crane?
If I could just add, not to pat ourselves on the back too much or to get too critical of Europe, their networks, and this was mentioned earlier, exist all the way back to the conflict in Bosnia. So these networks of recruitment and radicalization have been around a lot longer than we have had in the United States. And so part of the explanation for why
let me get this straight. NATO, a predominantly Christian or Christian heritage organization, went to war with a Christian country, Serbia, to defend the people of Bosnia, then of Kosovo, the two of the three Muslim-majority states in Europe today. And instead of people saying, my God, here NATO is living up to its values and defending people regardless of their religion, instead somehow the narrative was, now it's time to blow things up in the countries that saved the people of Kosovo and Bosnia, the Muslim people of Bosnia and Kosovo.
So let me explain it on two levels. You're talking about motivations, and I think there is still part of that exists that NATO and the United States intervened too late. So there is that. But I'm actually talking about an infrastructure.
Wait a minute. The Muslim-majority countries intervened not at all and saved almost no one. But those who saved people didn't do a good enough job. Continue.
Right. No, I agree. But what I want to actually point out is the logistics network that exists and the financing network that exists that then funneled fighters and money into that conflict, then reversed. And that network is what they're trying to root out now.
The countries of Kosovo and Bosnia and the Muslim majority area of Bosnia-Herzegovina exist because of NATO. Have their leaders and imams been helpful in pushing back against Islamic extremism, given the fact that we saved them?
So I'll just say, I know you've done work on this. I'll just say one thing that I think is really interesting about the Dayton Accords, which is that they actually required all of the foreign fighters who went, and there were 3,000 who went to fight in Bosnia, to leave. And this is something that the countries have been working hard to make sure that they reinforce more recently than they did earlier. But I think that it's a good precedent, and they are trying with limited resources.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes itself for its questions. Thank you for being here. There's been some discussion about American intelligence sources spying on Americans. I have a great concern about that under the FISA courts issuing secret warrants on secret individuals. I do believe we can have security and safety, and we can have civil liberties in the United States. The abuse by the intelligence services, specifically 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, must end, or Congress must take immediate actions to stop FISA in its entirety. They are abusing the law as it already is, in my opinion, and that is our obligation because we are unique among nations. We have actually the Fourth Amendment to protect people and Americans in the United States. Something that hasn't been talked about very much is the use of social media. We have foreign terrorists using American companies to recruit, to raise money, to spread propaganda, and to teach other terrorists how to make bombs. The Europeans are talking about trying to rein in social media. We have a legislation that requires our government to tell us what the plan is on social media. To be very clear, the Supreme Court has said that terrorists do not have a constitutional right to use social media. It is not a free speech platform that they are entitled to use. That is not an issue. I'm a big First Amendment guy. But what are we doing to rein in our social media companies to stop recruitment, raising money, propaganda, and the building of bombs? Anybody want to talk about that? The Europeans are talking about fining these businesses, social media companies. What are we doing?
Sure, if I may, Jay, jump in. So if given the option, social media companies would want to be libertarian in their views, right? Take down no content. Because of pushback they've gotten from Capitol Hill, from the public, and saying, why are you letting your platforms be used by terrorists?
But they don't have a constitutional right to do that. It's no free speech issue.
And they could enforce the terms of services more rigorously. And in fact, we've seen that happen at least recently on Twitter. If you'd asked me 2 years ago what the platform of choice would be, I would tell you Twitter. My concern now is that it's largely the ISIS recruits are largely concentrated on Telegram, which
German company.
German, yeah. And so it allows for end-to-end encryption. And so what you're seeing is less of the fence sitters. So you're less likely to get a kid from the Midwest who's curious about ISIS. You're more likely to get the true believers who are looking for connectors and guys in Raqqa, the Legion in there, and saying, here's the bomb you should use.
So what can we do?
Yeah. So
Cut to the chase, Mr. Hughes.
cut to the chase, no problem. So there's a couple ways to do this. One, I think more pressure on Telegram, to the extent that the larger.
Should they be held criminally liable for that?
I think you could argue some level of civil liability may be in play here. I think the larger question for
Our
Telegram.
social media companies have brought down all of the child pornography sites with absolutely no problem about liberty,
Yep.
and that works. Why not use the same protocol to bring down terrorist sites? Why is that not occurring? Do you know?
Yeah, I think it's occurring more rapidly in Facebook and less so in other places. And so I would encourage social media companies to do what they're doing now, which is using AI and hashtagging technologies to proactively take down content.
Are any of you in favor of criminal or civil penalties against social media companies that don't bring down terrorist sites? Any of you? I guess that's a no. We shall see where we go with that. I have a question for all of you. How many ISIS terrorists are there in the world? Does anybody know? An estimate? Y'all are the experts. You got to give me a number here. Does anybody know how many? Nobody wants to say? Well, I think we ought to at least know how many of the enemy there are if we're going to be able to defeat them. What is the definition of a terrorist? Give me a working definition of a terrorist as opposed to some outlaw, criminal, whatever. What's a terrorist? That's Homer, the FBI.
Terrorist is someone who commits an act of violence or a violent crime justified by an extreme radical political or religious or social ideology.
And Mr. Hughes, you were not very encouraging. You said the answer is the problem is going to get worse on terrorist activity. I believe it was you or Mr. Simcox, one of you said that it's going to get worse in the future. It's not going to get. We're not going to have a grip on this. Why is it going to get worse? And that'll be my last question.
I think it's going to get worse because in terms of the relation of the subject matter today, I think the problems in Europe are stark, severe, and only getting worse. I don't see integration improving. I don't see security improving. And that obviously has an impact on the U.S. I think there are a number of trends in Europe which look terrifying, and that has an impact here.
All right. I want to thank all of you for being here. I will allow the ranking, or the gentleman, the chairman of the European Subcommittee to make a comment, final statement.
Short closing statement, but let me just note one of the things. Let me just say, with all due respect, saying that only 3% of the terrorists come from the migrant camps or have migrated in totally distorts the view of what we're really talking about. Because I imagine that 97% then come from migrant families that came and migrated into the Western European societies maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago or even 40 years ago. I mean, this isn't like you have a bunch of basically what we used to have in Northern Ireland, where you have a bunch of Catholics coming out who are basically part of the Irish society. This is basically the 3% figure you say, and every time you said it, I think was deceptive. And I don't mean you intentionally were deceiving people, but it was deceiving us as to what the real threat is. If you have a bunch of migrants coming into your country, and you're saying, well, only 3% of them will ever actually become terrorists, fine. But if 90% of the terrorists come from their children's or their children's children, yeah, you're putting yourself on a line to have a lot more terrorism in the future. And that's why maybe when they say terrorism is going to be an expanding problem, that's what we mean. So I don't feel comfortable saying, oh, well, only 3% of the people who are immigrants into my community are going to be susceptible to terrorism. But if their children are, 97% of the children are, whatever it is, that's a problem. So with that said, again, we are a country of freedom, and I have voted against, Your Honor, I voted with you to make sure we don't step on people who are here legally. I think that's very, I am in favor of legal immigration, whether they're as Muslims or other people. But the fact is, whoever comes here, we have to make sure that we understand the potential if they are coming here from a country that has a lot of terrorism or upheaval and radical Islamic culture. Then we have to be careful with that. We have to make sure that people in San Bernardino, Mr. Chairman, that San Bernardino, we had a young man who, I guess he was born here of Islamic parents. He went out with his wife and they slaughtered social service workers. They just went out and slaughtered them. I mean, no, that we should have taken more care there. We should have made sure that someone who is susceptible like that got a lot closer attention than what he obviously got. And it's a challenge for all of us. Freedom versus security, like we're saying, in all of our countries. So I don't think we can side totally with freedom, but I don't think we can side totally with security either. So thank you for helping us make up our minds to where that is. But I think the 3% number didn't help us. Okay, thank you very much.
Chair will recognize for the final statement the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the witnesses. We deal with this terrible epidemic that we have that's not just domestic but worldwide in so many different ways. Today we had a chance to focus in part on one of the things that really hasn't been fully utilized as a tool against this terrorism, and that's the idea of prevention. Sometimes the difficulty with prevention is you can't quantify it in statistics because if you prevented it, you may never know what indeed was responsible for stopping it. But just as the chair started the hearing saying that, for instance, in 1,000, I'm paraphrasing, in 1,000 attempts, all the terrorists have to do is be successful once. In prevention, and some of the techniques we're learning from Europe and they're learning from us, all we have to do is be successful one of those times to stop one of those terrible terrorist acts. So in programs that Mr. Hughes was involved in my region and other areas, they're successful. But they need resources and they need commitment. And they also need an understanding that law enforcement needs help outside of the traditional system to deal with preventing this. Thank you for a glimpse of that and some ideas today. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank the witnesses for being here. You are advised now that you may have some questions presented to you by members of the subcommittee that ran out of time. Please respond promptly to those questions and send us answers. And I thank the members for being here as well. This has been a very important and enlightful hearing. Thank you very much for your expertise. The subcommittees are adjourned.